Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Lasaniziris and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. And we'll start now showing the games that I played during the New York State Championship that took place about a week ago in Albany, New York. First, we're going to share the announcement of the tournament. As you see here, this was the 147th annual New York State Championship, and according to the organizers, this is the oldest chess championship that is still going on. The various sections. If you wanted to become the New York champion, you had to participate and be the best among the New York residents in the championship section, which is open to only players with rating 1900 and above, way above my rating. If that was too high for you, there was the under 2100 section, the under 1800 section, that is where I participated, the under 1500, and the under 1200 sections. Time controls. There were 6 games totally, 6 Swiss rounds. 40-80, which means you have to complete your first 40 moves in 80 minutes. SD30, sudden the 30, meaning if you completed your 40 moves in 80 minutes and the game was still on, you are given an additional 30 minutes to complete the remaining of your moves. And D30, which means delay 30 seconds, which meant that when it was your time to play, for the first 30 seconds, the clock would not move, and only after that, the clock would go downwards. The first round took place on Friday, August 29, starting 7 p.m. And let's give a look at my opponent. My opponent, as you see here, was Robert Carotenuto with a rating of 1463, which places him in the 81.9 percentile. And let's compare this with my rating. My rating is 15, or at least was 1582 before the championship. And this places me in the 86 percentile, which meant that I had better chances. But let's now go to the board of chess.com and go through the moves one by one to see what happened. I had the white pieces and Robert had the black. I start my regular way. My pawn goes to e4. And Robert replied to the French defense. Pawn goes to e6. My pawn goes to d4. Robert goes to d5. My bishop goes to d3. And Robert takes the pawn at e4. And I take back the pawn at e4. Robert sends his knight at f6 to attack my bishop on e4. And my bishop goes back to f3. And Robert develops his bishop to e7. And now we are leaving book. Until the previous move, meaning the first 5 moves of white, everything was book move, meaning they have been analyzed in the theory, and they are well known. Now, Robert sends his bishop to e7, which is a good move, but not the best. This gives me a very small advantage of plus 0.08. I'm going to repeat, I have mentioned the past. A positive number means white is better, negative means that black is better. And I send my pawn to c4 to control the d5 square and also have my knight free to go to c3 in the future. Yes. Robert castles. Now I send my knight to c3. And Robert sends his rook to e8. Computer says it's an inaccuracy and gives me a small advantage of plus 0.23. Would prefer the pawn to go to c5. This is the whole story is about controlling the d4 square at the center. I send my knight to e2 to control the d4 pawn. And Robert sends his knight to d7. My bishop goes now to f4, and there is a threat. If my knight goes to b5, then my bishop to c7, the black queen is lost. At very minimum, if I can put even my knight there, then the rook, black's rook, would be in trouble. But Robert sees this thing and defends by placing his bishop on d6. Inaccuracy says the computer, my advantage becomes 0.43. I send my bishop to g5. Let's see what the computer would like. The computer would have preferred the bishop to go to f8. I'm not sure why, because yes, this would give an escape square for the queen, but if my knight went to d5 to b5, things would not be easy for black, because if I put my knight on c7, the rook is on a8 is attacked. If the knight leaves, then the bishop attacks the rook. But okay, that's how I was thinking. And I really expected Robert to play something along the d6 bishop to d6 line. Now go to g5 as I mentioned. The reason being to pin the knight at f6, but computer thinks it's an inaccuracy. And that's why now Robert has advantage, 0.60. Computer would rather have me exchange a bishop. Let's continue now. Robert is going to unpin his knight by sending the bishop back to e7. And now it's time for me to castle. And Robert will send his knight to f8, giving some space for the bishop, controlling the gc square. The computer doesn't like it. Would prefer the pawn to go to e5 and exert pressure on d4. That's why now my advantage becomes 0.86. These are the intricate details of the opening that the grandmasters are very familiar with, but at my level, this is what I like to call the fine print. Now, my bishop goes to f4, once again attack the pawn at c7, or at least exert some pressure, not yet attack because defended by the queen, but if Robert does nothing, my knight goes to b5, but Robert does something, pawn goes to c6 to block it. Now my pawn goes to d5. Time to start opening the position. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy, my advantage falls down to 0.03. But let's see what happened from here on. I wanted to exchange to open the board since I had more space. He takes, c takes, knight takes, knight takes, and c pawn takes. Until now, I think these are all more or less forced moves. And now I have two choices, either to use the queen or the bishop to go to d5. I decided to use the bishop. If in the future, for any reason, the rook and the bishop would disappear, my bishop goes f7 check and I win the queen. Of course, this is not possible now, but every constraint you put on your opponent is improving your position. I mean, the opponent has to keep in mind, make sure at least one of the rook and bishop stay there. And Robert decides to stop this plan by sending his knight on e6. Because now, even if bishop and rook would disappear, I couldn't win the queen that way. My queen now goes to b3. Still the same pressure on the knight, but I don't like my queen to be exposed to my opponent's queen. Robert is suggesting an exchange. Here, the situation is the following. If I exchange queens, as Robert would like, then Robert has double pawns on the b file, which is not a good idea. But on the other side, Robert's rook on the a file has a semi-open file, which increases the scope of the rook at a8. Myself, I decide to exchange the queens. And now you see that my bishop is threatened. The moment that Robert put his knight on e6, in addition to stopping the trick I had before, threatens my knight at f4. Currently, it's protected by the knight at e2, but this puts a constraint on me. I should not move the e2 knight. And as I mentioned before, it's better if you don't have constraints and impose them on your opponent. That's why my bishop goes back to g3. And Robert places his bishop on f6. By doing so, threatens the opponent b2 and also perhaps could threaten my rook. So I move my rook to b1, and I'm lucky that my pawn at a2 is covered by my bishop. Otherwise, Robert's rook on a8 would take it. I say I'm lucky because I had not planned it. Only when it was time to see where to put the rook, I saw that I can safely put it to b1 because now none of my pawns is going to be captured. Robert will send his knight at c5. And now my knight goes to c3. Robert develops his bishop, sending it to e6. And my rook goes to d1 to better protect my bishop, because now it's only the knight that was protecting the bishop. You may wonder, why don't I take the bishop first? There is a saying to take a mistake, which means that if you take first, you help your opponent place their pieces better. But if they take first, then your pieces are placed better as they take back. So your first instinct, if there's a possible exchange, is, if possible, have the opponent start it. Robert will take my knight on c3. Instead of taking back immediately, first I take the knight on e6. Robert takes it back with the pawn. This creates double pawns for Robert, but Robert had the choice to take it to the rook. I don't have any choice. I must take it back with a pawn if I don't want to lose material. And that goes to e4 for Robert, attacking first my bishop on g3 and double my pawns, and then the pawn at c3. And not only that, if I do nothing, then there is a fork with my two rooks b1, d1. I want to avoid it. I want to avoid everything. And this is done by sending my bishop to e5. Now it covers the pawn at c3. But Robert will take now my pawn at a2. After all, now it's not covered any longer after all the exchanges. What do I do? Send my rook to d7 and threatening the pawn at b7. In addition, my other rook threatens the pawn at b6, but I better be careful because there is a back rank possibility if I'm not careful. Robert will put his knight on f6 now. At least I don't have to worry about the c3 pawn. I take the pawn at b7. Robert makes sure that there is no background for him, but there was no background for him either. Most likely it's a waste, and yes, the computer says inaccuracy, and by this moment my advantage has increased to 164. I want to take the other pawn as well, at b6. And now I am a pawn ahead. In addition, computer thinks it's a mistake, would rather first have me deal with the background issue and not allow the knight at g4. Perhaps because the pawn at b6 was always there. Let's see what would happen if Robert would put his rook at a6. Would have to put my bishop. Still out of the pawn. And Robert puts his rook at a5, threatening my bishop. And since I'm a pawn ahead, and the computer says thinks that this was a miss. Instead of that, the bishop could go to d7. Yes, if it went to d7, I would be in a bad situation because both my rook and my bishop would be attacked. I would have to place my rook here back, at least to avoid any material damage. But it seems I got lucky with this miss, so my advantage from 0.02 goes up to 114. Now, since I am ahead in material, I want to exchange. And I have explained in previous videos, and I'll explain again, why if you're ahead, you want, if possible, to exchange. Because so long as there is material, you may blunder a piece. There's more chances you may blunder a piece because you have more of them. Of course, your opponent may blunder, but you're winning either way or other, so you don't win too much by your opponent's blunder, but your blunder is going to change the result. In addition, usually there are fewer tactical possibilities because sometimes there are possibilities that are very deep, so players don't see them during the game. They only see them if by chance they start going through the first few moves. It's not always by chance, sometimes by instinct. You don't know that there's something to gain in the end, but you know if you follow this line, there's a good chance that something could be gained. And the more pieces on the board, the better these secret chances may exist. This is, of course, at our level, the level about 1500, between 15 and 1600. At the level above 2000, players can calculate very, very accurately. There are much fewer chances that combination may exist by chance. So I'm going to take the knight, and I don't care if the computer doesn't like it. It strengthens my position. Of course, Robert has to take back. And look where we are now, rook ending. I have an extra pawn, and also have a better pawn structure because even if you remove my extra pawn is, by the way, a passed pawn, that's great. And the other pawns, even if you remove that, mine are next to each other while Robert's are separated. So I have quite a nice position. And now I want to change rooks. I wish I could go to an ending with only my 4 versus the 3 pawns. That would be still winning. How do I do it? Taking advantage of the pin. Robert, instead of immediately exchanging, he also follows the motto to take is a mistake, let your opponent start the exchange first. His rook goes to a8, and now I exchange. My advantage is even greater now. The computer thinks I only have 0.88, but I have a nice pass pawns plus my other pawns are connected, which Roberts are not. And let's see what happens now that we settle to an ending with rook and 4 versus rook and 3 pawns. I want to activate my king, goes to f1. Robert sends his rook to e7. My king goes to e2. In accuracy, the computer, most likely it was a master move. And the rook goes to d7. What Robert wants to do is block my king, but he could have done it in one move, from e8 to d8. He didn't need to do it in 2 moves. Computer thinks that this is a mistake. Would rather have Robert activate his king, and my advantage becomes 2.20. And let's see what's going to happen now. Because these advantages are the ones that the computer shows, but for average players, it's not easy to exploit them to win. I want to start now pushing my c pawn, goes to c4. Robert king goes to f7. My pawn goes to c5. Push the passed pawn. Some people would say, why not put the rook behind the passed pawn in c1? Of course, ideally, yes, but I can do it anytime, only when it's attacked. I can continue now pushing my pawn. Robert's rook goes to a7. My pawn goes to c6. And if I could have a second move in a row, rook goes to b7, and Robert would be forced to exchange pawn b7 and promote. But Robert is not going to fall for my idea. Instead, he's going to check me at a2. And this moment, I saw that the win was not so secure as I thought, because I would have to move my king, and no matter where I move my king, Robert would put his king at e7 and would just be in time to stop my pawn. Yes, I could check from b7, pawn goes to, then king goes to d6, pawn goes to c7, king goes to d7, and my pawn cannot promote. I'm even running out of spaces to place my rook, and I have to lose the pawn. What to do, what to do? At least make sure that Robert cannot put his rook on c2 and control my pawn. You may say, yes, but the f2 pawn is going to be lost. Yes, that's exactly what I wanted, and that's exactly what Robert should not have done. But the pawn is too tempting. Ideally, Robert should move his king to e7. He takes a pawn on f2. And the moment I saw that, although I didn't know that the computer would label it as a mistake, I knew that I was going to win. You see, my advantage from 124 goes to 658. Because now I placed my pawn on c7, and Robert cannot stop it, cannot put the rook on c2, cannot put his king anywhere nearby. That was a crucial move. He's taking my pawn on f2. That was exactly the crucial move that gave me the win. He'll try one last attempt. King goes to f1. I'm going to put, of course, my king to c2 to cover my rook. But even if I grant him my rook, the pawn becomes queen and I win. But why give unnecessary material to Robert? He goes to f2. My king goes to c3. Why to c3? First of all, there is no chance for any repetition. And now Robert cannot even check any longer, because if he puts his rook on f3, I'll take the pawn. At this point, my opponent, Robert Carotenuto, resigned. Robert, thanks for the game. In spite of the result, you played quite well, I believe. And of course, you had to deal with an opponent that had a rating quite higher than yours. But let's now give a look at the review. What does the chess.com computer think about the overall game? 89.6 accuracy for me, 81.2 for Robert. And our ratings, 2400 for me, 2100 for Robert, way above our real ratings. I really believe that this game rating is quite flattering. And really, if you want to improve, you don't need this kind of flattery. I don't need to have, okay, that was a winning game, but I had games that I played very poorly and I lost, and it was 2000 higher. I don't need that. Let's now look at the categories. None of us had a brilliant move. I had two great moves. I had 12 versus 10 for Robert in the best, 5 versus 8 in the excellent, and 9 versus 6 in the good category. Book, my first 5 were from the book, the first Roberts were from the book. Inaccuracy is now the negative part. 4 for me, 6 for Robert, mistakes, 2 mistakes each of us, misses, 1 miss for me, 3 for Robert, and none of us blundered. So this concludes my report from the first round of the New York State Chess Championship that took place in Albany. And we'll continue in the next video with the second round. The second round will take place the next day, Saturday, August 30, starting from 6 p.m. But, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching this video. Thanks to the subscribers. If you have not subscribed, all you need to do is click this subscribe button. Thanks for the ones of you that have liked some of my videos or have left nice comments. I am Harry Lasaniziris. This is my GrecoChess YouTube channel. Goodbye.